Gukesh starts the game with the move e4, and we're in the final round of Tata Steel chess tournament, and today we will crown the winner. It will be either Gukesh or another young Indian Grandmaster Praggnanandhaa. Both have 8.5 points before this round started. Gukesh's opponent in this game is another top Grandmaster from India, Arjun Erigaisi, and he answers with the move e5. Knight f3, knight f6, and we have Petrov's defense. Knight takes the pawn on e5, d6, attacking the knight. Knight goes to c4. Black takes the pawn back on e4, queen e2, queen e7, and now white can play d3, kicking the knight out, exchange the queens, and the game would probably end in a draw. But Gukesh needs a win and plays the move knight e3. Knight goes back to f6, developing the knight on c3 for Gukesh. Erigaisi develops the bishop, g3 to put the bishop on g2. Knight develops on c6, bishop g2, queen d7, targeting the square of h3, and we'll find out why later. Castle short side, castle long side, and here we have a typical position where white castle short, black castle long, and white will start attacking on the queen side of the board, black will start attacking on the king side of the board. This is great for all chess lovers because the game would be very exciting and interesting. And immediately Gukesh starts with the move b4. It's not good for black to take the pawn on b4 because the rook will go to b1, attacking the knight. Pawn on b7 would be targeted by both the rook and the bishop from g2, and therefore, instead of taking the pawn on b4, Erigaisi goes d5, creating a threat of his own, playing d4, attacking both knights, forking both knights. But Gukesh plays b5, attacking the knight on c6, and the knight goes to the edge of the board with the possibility in the future to go to a more active square on c4. d4, blocking the d5 pawn by Gukesh, and black realizes that the best piece in the white position here is the bishop on g2. It's really a great piece in white position, and black goes bishop h3, offering exchange of the bishops. And it feels like the exchange is inevitable, but in reality, the best move for white in this position was, believe it or not, bishop f3. Why bishop f3 is the best move? Because after, if black takes the rook on f1 and win the exchange, it turns out that the pawn on d5 is almost impossible to protect. And after the pawn on d5 falls, the bishop, the light square bishop of white, becomes absolute monster piece for white, and their position would be better. So therefore, bishop f3 actually led to Gukesh advantage. He either didn't see it or didn't believe it. And he exchanged the bishops on h3. Bishop takes h3, queen takes h3. Queen goes to f3, attacking the pawn on d5. Black ignores it and plays h5. Erigaisi starts attacking on the h file on his own. Knight takes d5, and actually, in deeper calculations, knight c takes d5 was much better for white. Knight e takes d5 is actually already a mistake. After h4, black's attack becoming dangerous. Knight takes f6, exchange of the knights on f6, and a rook d1. Now, in case white played queen takes f6, they lose the game immediately after pawn takes g3, and there is no stopping checkmate on h file. Therefore, rook d1, actually preparing an escape for the king. Erigaisi takes the pawn, White takes the pawn. As of right now, h1 square is protected. And if, let's say, queen h2 check, king escapes from checks, and black goes knight c4, activating the knight. Bishop f4, developing another piece on active square f4, and Erigaisi goes bishop h6. He again realizes that the best piece in white position currently is bishop on f4, and he will be protecting the king in some variations, so he decides to exchange the bishops. Not much choice here. Bishops are exchanged. Black's position is already pretty much winning. Queen g2, hoping that Erigaisi will go for queen exchange, and in that case, his attack would be over. Erigaisi obviously doesn't exchange queens, queen h5, rook b1. Gukesh is trying some activity on the king side, on the queen side, sorry, rook h8, and now this battery is looking more and more dangerous. White goes rook b4, attacking the knight on c4. The knight goes to a3. b6. White is trying to be aggressive on the queen side of the board. Simply c takes b6, rook a4, attacking the knight and the pawn on a7. And the position looks at least promising for white, but in reality, black just goes knight b5. Very strong move. And now if knight takes b5, there is a checkmate here in basically a couple of moves after queen takes d1, because the knight is protecting the rook on d1, so it cannot take the knight on b5. Therefore, you have to protect the rook first, and the rook protects the knight. Everything seems to be okay for white, except knight takes c3, rook takes c3, and in this position, the king can go either to safe haven in the corner of the board, as it usually does, or to the middle of the board. Now, when rooks and queens are on the board, you would think that the best move would be king b8, but king d8 is actually a better continuation, although both were winning. So king d8, white has no checks, which is important, and plays f3. f3 is played because the threat of a checkmate was real. f3, and here, pretty much the decisive move of the game, queen b5. Attacking the rook on a4, and if the rook went away, as it did, capturing the pawn on a7, in this position, Erigaisi could win it 10 different ways, but decided to go this way. Rook h1, check, king f2, rook h2, the queen is pinned, black king is safe, and Gukesh, the world champion, resigned in this position because after losing a queen, he loses the game. Gukesh opponent for the first place in the tournament, Praggnanandhaa from India, played with black pieces against Vincent Keymer from Germany. Keymer has 6 points out of 13. This game is not as important to him as for Praggnanandhaa, and he game with the move e4. Praggnanandhaa answers with c6, and we have Caro-Kann. Caro-Kann defense, knight f3, d5. Not the most popular variation, by the way. After knight c3, Praggnanandhaa goes bishop g4, pinning the knight to the queen. h3, kicking out the bishop. Exchange on f3. Queen takes f3, e6. Very solid structure for black. Bishop e2 developing the bishop, knight f6, castle, d4. d4 attacks the knight, and it looks like a good move because the knight goes to b1, to the initial square where it started the game. It seems like it's good for black, but in reality, this continuation is actually better for white. Better for white in long term. their game becomes much more easier. We'll see it very quickly. Bishop develops on d6, c3 immediately challenging black center on d4, c5 protecting the center, exchange the pawns on d4, knight goes to a3 to the side of the board, so it can go to a very nice square on c4. You don't want to exchange a very good black square bishop for a knight on a3 because then white will have an advantage of two bishops in an open position and their game would be much, much more pleasant. So therefore, castle, knight goes to an active square on c4, bishop moves back to c7, d3, opening the door for the black square bishop. Knight develops to c6, a4, preventing any counterplay with the moves b5. a6, still preparing b5, g3, now b5, and very smart move, knight a3 for Vincent Keymer. He didn't want to exchange the pawns on b5 because that would give black some activity on the a file. Knight goes to a3. Now actually the pawn is under attack. The rook defends the pawn, exchange the pawns on b5, and white develops the bishop on g5, pinning the knight to the queen. Now black plays bishop d6, rook c1 attacking the knight. Praggnanandhaa makes a nice maneuver with that knight, attacking the queen first. After queen goes away, the knight goes to d7, and now the knights are connected, always a good thing. So the pin is not so important anymore because now the queen can move anywhere, and the knight from d7 will protect the knight on f6. White plays knight c2, moving the knight to better squares from the edge of the board. Queen b6, b4. Black wanted to play b4, b3, extend the pawns on the queen side, and Keymer blocks that idea with the move b4. e5, on the other hand, on one hand, protecting the pawn on d4, on the other hand, it blocks their own bishop. h4, creating a loft for the king. Rook a8. Praggnanandhaa wants to create some ideas on the a file. Queen f1, rook c8, exchange of the rooks on a8, rook a1, queen c6, and another exchange of the rooks. This position is even, and at this point, if Praggnanandhaa knew that his main opponent for the first place in the tournament, Gukesh, lost his game, then he would simply make a draw in this position. But he didn't know that, so he was thinking that he still needs to play for a win. Queen c1, queen b7, some maneuvering is starting here. Bishop d1, knight e8, bishop d2, not much happening. Knight b8, knight e1, knight c6, bishop b3, and white gives up the pawn on b4 because first of all, they couldn't really protect it, and second of all, it's not as important in this position because white exchanges the knight to the bishop, and after bishop takes b4, they play knight f3, and the pawn on e5 is under attack. And you cannot play f6 because that pawn is pinned to the king. Queen goes to e7, protecting the pawn on e5. As we can see, the pawn on e5 is pretty weak. It cannot be protected by another pawn. So white goes queen c6. The better move was to go further, queen c8, and pin the knight to the king. That would have given white a better advantage. Queen c6 is a logical move because the attack is on the pawn b5. Praggnanandhaa plays h6, creating an escape square for the king. Queen takes b5, bishop goes back to d6, and h5, blocking any potential black pawn movement on the king's side. Knight f6, attacking the pawn on h5. As a matter of fact, very difficult to protect it. So white don't protect it and just plays knight h4. Now in this position, If black took the pawn on h5, white winning with the move knight f5. Queen has to go away, let's say to f8, and after exchange on square d6 and queen e8, king h7, bishop goes to f7, attacking the knight, and the checkmate on g8 is inevitable. So let's go back. Cannot take the pawn on h5. Praggnanandhaa plays queen d7, offering exchange of the queens. Keymer, to his credit, wants to play for a win in the game that doesn't really matter to him. He declines the exchange of the queens, plays queen a6, kings goes to h7, queen a2, attacking the pawn on f7. Has to be protected, kings goes to g8. Queen a8 check, queen e8, blocking the check, and again offering the exchange of the queens. And again, Keymer declines. He goes to a6, attacking the bishop on d6. Praggnanandhaa goes full defense. Bishop f8. Queen b6, and here is the first major mistake of the game. Knight h7 wasn't a good move, and the best variation for white started with the move knight g6. But it's not so easy to calculate all the variations after this move. Keymer is a great grandmaster, but not a computer. So he went with a more logical move, queen g6. Now, obviously, you cannot take it because the pawn is pinned. Knight goes to g5, queen f5, queen b8, attacking the bishop on b3. Bishop goes away to c4, bishop d6. Basically, Praggnanandhaa is standing still and waiting for his opponent to do anything. Black cannot really win this, they're just hoping for a draw. At this point, Praggnanandhaa possibly knew that Gukesh lost, because Gukesh lost pretty quickly. So he just needs a draw to become a champion. And the position is better for white, but you probably should make it a draw for black. So what happens next? King g2, king f8. A huge mistake by Praggnanandhaa. Not sure if he was tired or the pressure got to him, but king f8 was really not a great move because, and the reason being, because the move knight f3. That's a beautiful deflection. You cannot take the knight because there is a checkmate on f7. So therefore, in this position, black doesn't have many choices. Let's say king g8, or better variation. Let's say queen c7. Knight takes g5, h takes g5, and in this case, you don't take the pawn on g5, but go queen h7. Queen h7, check here, taking the pawn on g7, and the pawn goes and queening. So that was an easy win for Keymer. He didn't find it. Tired also. Let's go back to this position. So king f8, big mistake. Vincent Keymer didn't find immediate win and played knight g6 check. Kings go to g8, the pawn was pinned, and it's still pinned. Queen goes to d7, again full defense from Praggnanandhaa, bishop f8, knight goes to h4, bishop d6, knight f5, bishop goes back and forth like a yo-yo, knight goes to h4, bishop goes to d6, and here you think that both players decided that the draw is fine. Let's repeat moves. And Praggnanandhaa would become a champion. To Keymer's credit, he goes knight f3 and decides to play for a win. Good for him. Queen f8. Exchange the knights on g5, and bishop takes f7. So the issue with bishop takes f7 is that if queen takes f7, then queen takes d6, and that queen's ending is winning for white. on a grandmaster level. Praggnanandhaa knows this and therefore plays king h8. Keymer goes bishop b3. His position is totally winning, but it's according to the computers. It's a light square bishop against a dark square bishop. It's different color, different square color bishops, which is usually have some drawish motifs. So that's why to win this position for white is not so easy. Bishop e7, queen e6. Now the black queen is glued to the square g8 because there is a checkmate threat there. Bishop f6, bishop c4, king h7, queen f5 check. Still winning for white, but how? Not easy. Queen h8, king h8, queen g6, bishop e7, bishop f7. Black position is really suffocating here. Very difficult to make moves. But still, how do you win this? Bishop b4. Queen f5, bishop b6. He goes back and Praggnanandhaa goes back and forth. And Keymer decided to move his king into the action. King h3, bishop e7, king g4. Bishop f6, bishop e6, queen e7. Still not sure how to win this. f4, trying to break through with pawns. Exchange of pawns on f4, queen d6. And here Keymer makes a critical mistake. Bishop c4 is a mistake, and now position is getting closer to even. Black plays queen b8, bishop goes to d5, pawn taken on f4. Now if white takes it with the queen, then there is exchange of the queens. So obviously he didn't do that, but Keymer makes a mistake of the game, or at least at this point of the game, and plays the move e5. The idea of the move e5 is not so clear, because after bishop takes e5, and again threatening the mate on h7, maybe that was the idea actually, black just plays king g8, queen e6 check. This position is a draw. So it looks like Praggnanandhaa is gonna become a champion. Queen e6 check, king goes back to h8, queen g6, threatening the checkmate, the only move. First the check on c8, bishop f5, the only move, queen g8, protecting the checkmate. It's a draw. King goes to f3, bishop goes to f6, bishop e4, and here comes bishop e5. With 39 seconds to go on the clock, feeling enormous pressure to become a champion, Praggnanandhaa makes an unfortunate mistake. And Keymer capitalized on this mistake by the move h6. Bishop went to b8, because if you take the pawn here, there's just a checkmate. So bishop went to b8, queen g5, and here, after queen f8, a very nice geometrical motif. Takes, queen takes, queen h4, check. Praggnanandhaa resigns, because after the only move, king g8, check, bishop d5, and you either lose the queen, or if the king goes here, there is a checkmate on d8. So Keymer won, Praggnanandhaa lost. Praggnanandhaa and Gukesh have 8.5 points out of 13, and tied for the first place. Let's take a look at the standings. Gukesh 8.5, Praggnanandhaa 8.5. Third place, a player who played really beautiful chess in this tournament in many games, Nazarbek from Uzbekistan. So what do we have? We have a tiebreak. A tiebreak will decide who will win Tata Steel chess tournament in Netherlands of 2025. Gukesh Damaraja, the world champion from India, or Praggnanandhaa, also a grandmaster from India. Gukesh is 18 years old, Praggnanandhaa is 19 years old, and they play two blitz games, 3 minutes each for the whole game, with 2 seconds added for each move they make. Gukesh with knight f3, that's ready opening, d5, c4, e6, g3. Typical idea of the ready opening, the bishop goes to g2. Although with a pawn on c4, you can call it an English opening as well. Knight develops to f6, bishop goes to g2. Praggnanandhaa extends the pawn to d4, castle, developing the knight on c6, d3, opening the diagonal for the black square bishop, bishop c5, all developing moves, a3, white wants to move b4, therefore a5, protecting the square of b4, bishop goes to g5, pinning the knight to the queen, h6, kicking out the bishop cannot continue pinning the knight because after bishop h4 there would be g5 and the bishop would be lost. He has no moves. So after h6, bishop takes on f6, queen takes on f6, and knight develops on d2, going to a great square for the knight on e4. Black goes to e7, preventing attack on the queen from e4. The knight still goes to e4, now threatening the bishop, and although it's protected, black plays a4 and allows white to exchange their very good knight from e4 to a bishop that looked pretty lousy on a square c5 because it was blocked by its own pawn on d4. Queen takes c5, knight goes back to d2, so the reason Gukesh could exchange one of his good knights on c5 because he has another knight going to a great square of e4. Short castle, queen c2, e5, and rook b1, preparing the move b4. Rook a7 by Praggnanandhaa. This is a modern way to play chess. 30 years ago, those moves were not allowed. I'm joking, of course, they were allowed. This is a legal move, but nobody played like that. b4, attacking on the queen side. En passant, the pawn takes pawn, rook takes on b3. White's position is much more pleasant, although computers think that this is a drawish position. But again, these are computers, but these are humans who are tired, who played already 13 rounds of serious long chess games. They played today, and now they need to decide a winner, so the pressure is on. Queen goes to e7, rook goes to b5, allowing black to take the pawn on a3, and rook e1, preparing some game on the e file. Black is with an extra pawn, white with initiative. Rook goes back to favorite square a7. Queen goes to b2, now the bishop cannot move because the pawn on b7 will fall. Rook goes to d8, h4 creating a loop for the king. Black goes back with the knight to b8. I guess Praggnanandhaa decided that the knight on c6 didn't do anything. He decided to transfer it to more useful squares. e3, that was the plan all along. c6, attacking the rook goes back to b3, and queen c7, removing the queen from this dangerous e file where the white rook is. Knight f3, knight a6, going to a good square on c5. And very smart move by Gukesh, rook a3, pinning the knight. So the knight cannot go to a good square because the rook will fall on a7. Black goes queen d6, exchange the pawns on d4, and a queen b6, attacking the rook. The rook goes back to a8. And a brilliant move, knight d4. Knight takes d4. And here, why black couldn't take the knight because there is a deflection tactics, very famous in chess, a rook e8 check. After rook a8 check, if the king goes away, then you take the rook, and if you take the rook, white takes the queen and win. Now, it's very important that in this particular position, Praggnanandhaa saw this and obviously didn't take the bait and didn't take the knight on d4. Now, the rook on a3 is also under attack, but there is a rook on d8, which is under attack. So the black played knight c7, exchanged the rook on a8, queen a7, very unusual spot for the queen. Knight goes to c7 and queen a5. Now, already black takes the knight on d4, and Gukesh takes the knight on c7. This position is even, but again, it just psychologically feels like white are attacking. Queen takes the pawn on d3, so actually black has an extra pawn and it doesn't matter because white's position is more active. Getting to the 7th rank, attacking the pawn on f7, bishop protects the pawn on e6, but loses the pawn on b7. And Praggnanandhaa plays c5. That pawn on c6 was under attack. Queen c7, you cannot take the pawn here because the rook would be under attack. Cannot take the pawn with the queen, I mean. And here comes the mistake of the game. Very unfortunate mistake by Praggnanandhaa, because if you remember, about 10 moves ago, he saw the deflection tactics by Gukesh. But in this position, under a tremendous time pressure with 3 seconds to go, he forgot about it, he missed it, he buckled under pressure. I don't know the reason. And you know what's coming. And what's coming is e8. Rook e8, and if you take the rook, Gukesh will take the queen. Nothing you can do. For some reason, Praggnanandhaa decided to play about 3-4 more moves without the rook. So I'll go quickly here, and after this series of moves and check on e4, black resigned. Praggnanandhaa is without a rook. The position is lost, and Gukesh is leading 1-0. Game 2. Praggnanandhaa is white, Gukesh is black. d4, knight f6, bishop g5. Unusual opening for grandmasters, Trumpovsky attack. d5, e3, g6. The bishop goes to g7. Knight develops to f3, bishop goes to g7, knight develops to d2, with possible ideas in the future to play c4. Short castle, h3, not allowing any black pieces to get to g4. c5, aggressive move from Gukesh. c3, very solid from Praggnanandhaa. Now let's remember that this game Praggnanandhaa must win, otherwise he lost the title of the tournament to Gukesh. And Gukesh can play for a draw, which sometimes is very dangerous when you need a draw, is sometimes works against you. b6, bishop goes to a nice diagonal on d3, knight develops on c6, Praggnanandhaa castles short, h6 attacking the bishop on g5, bishop goes back to a good diagonal, h2 b8, knight goes back to d7 with the idea to prepare the move e5. If black plays e5 in this position, if they're allowed to play e5, their position would simply be much better. White goes bishop g3, bishop b7, developing, bishop goes back to e2, and here comes e5. And the reason Praggnanandhaa moved the bishops away to avoid the move at e5 with the tempo attacking the bishop on f4 and then threatening the fork, because when the bishop was here, there was a fork threat e4. Exchange the pawns. on e5. Now the knight becomes very strong in the middle of the board. Black's position is visually better. Computer again says that this is even, but much more pleasant for black and much easier to play for black. a4, trying to create some counterplay on the queen side. Knight goes back to d7. Queen c2, developing the queen. Rook goes to an open file e. Rook e1, rook c8, rook d1, all developing pieces, including queen e7. Queen goes back to b1. There's some maneuvering going on the board. Knight f8, computer shows that this is a big mistake. It's not a big mistake, but on a grandmaster level, it is. And the reason it's a mistake, because black allowed white to play e4. And e4 is a big advantage for white, because after d takes e4, there is a move bishop d3. This pawn is pinned, so it will be taken by white pieces. White pieces blossom in the middle of the board, become much more active, and their position becomes really great. So that was a great move, e4, but Praggnanandhaa didn't find it, and he played very passive bishop f1 with the idea to play e4. He didn't realize that he could play that move immediately. Knight e6, and now e4, but it's a little bit too late, because after d4, queen c2, black are absolutely fine here. Knight g5 to exchange the knights. Knight goes back to h2, so decline the exchange of the knights because he wants to play more aggressively with the move f4. Remember, Praggnanandhaa needs to win this. The draw is in Gukesh's favor. Rook d8, e5, gaining some space in the middle. Queen goes to c7, removing the queen from this x-ray from the rook on e1. Knight g4, king goes to h8. This position is already much better for white, and the reason it's much better for white, because knight goes to d6. So it goes to c4 in order to go to d6. After the knight gets to d6, white position would be significantly better. And again, let's take a look at the clock. 49 seconds for Praggnanandhaa, remaining 23 for Gukesh. Not easy to find best moves under such time pressure. Knight e6 and knight d6, dismantling black position. Rook has to move away to f8. Bishop develops to a very nice square on c4. Knight goes e7. Gukesh goes full defense here. Queen c1, attacking the pawn on h6 with the knight and the queen. Queen c6, checkmate on g2. Praggnanandhaa sees it, takes the bishop with the knight. Queen takes b7 and takes the pawn on h6. Now, obviously, you cannot take here, because after queen h6, king g8, bishop takes the knight. The king is totally not safe here, and the game would be ending quickly because the black squares are absolutely not protected, and white has a black square bishop, and black do not have a counterpart. So therefore, bishop on g7 must stay on the board for black to have any chances in this game. Knight goes to a square of d5, nice square. Knight removes, comes back to g4, queen e7, rook d3, moving the rook to potentially to the king side of the board. Queen g5, offering the exchange of the queens, and I'm not sure if that was out of despair or Gukesh really thought that without queens this position could be saved, but after the queen exchange, it was actually much easier to white to capitalize on their advantage. After c takes d4, knight b4, attacking the rook just moves away. Rook takes d4, exchange the rooks on d4, rook d1, attacking the pawn on d4. Knight from c6 protects it. Bishop attacks the knight. The position is totally winning for white, and here Gukesh actually makes it easier for Praggnanandhaa. He plays knight e7, and after bishop h4, on a skewer he loses the knight. He cannot protect one of those knights. Praggnanandhaa ties the tiebreak at 1-1. So what do we have next? We play till one player wins the game. So kind of Armageddon, but with a little bit different rules. Praggnanandhaa has white pieces, Gukesh has black. White in general in chess has a little bit of the advantage. To make it more equal, Praggnanandhaa was given 2.5 minutes on the clock with 2 seconds addition for each move, and Gukesh was given 3 minutes. So Gukesh has 30 seconds more on the clock, but Praggnanandhaa has white. And let's see what happened in this game. d4, d5, knight f3, knight f6, bishop f4, and we have London system. London system is very popular in the club level. As to grandmasters, it's considered very safe for black, actually. White do not get any particular advantage in the opening, and black has an easy game. They play e6, e3, c5, challenging white center. Bishop develops on e2. Exchange of bishops was offered. First, white takes the pawn on c5. Bishop takes c5. Castle. Castle short side for Gukesh. Praggnanandhaa offers an exchange of pawns. Exchange of pawns happens. a6. Exchange of queens happens, and this game is going probably to end in a draw, but both players still have almost the whole 3 minutes or 2.5 minutes for Praggnanandhaa on the clock, so they continue playing, developing pieces, putting the rooks on the open files, maneuvering with bishops, putting the knight in a nice central square, attacking the bishop. Bishop goes back, offering the exchange of bishop on b5 for Gukesh. Exchange happens. Double pawns, not good for black. Open file A is good for black, so pluses and minuses and everything. a3, the pawn was under attack by the rook. Knight develops to c6, rook goes to d1, rook goes to c8. The position is almost symmetrical and looks like it's gonna be a draw. King goes to f1, knight b6, knight e4. I'm going quickly here because nothing much is happening, and the most interesting thing will happen actually at the very end of this game. After knight c4, the pawn on b2 is attacked, and it's pretty much impossible to defend it. The move rook b1 doesn't, first of all, look sad, and second of all, doesn't really help because black will just take the rook on d1 and then still will gain on b2. Therefore, exchange of the rooks and rook c2, protecting the pawn this way from the c2 square. Check on d1, king e2, and rook b1 makes sense. And white cannot protect the pawn on b2, so they go counterattack. They play knight c3, attacking the pawn on b5. Rook takes b2, rook takes b2, knight takes b2, knight takes b5. And we have an endgame with 3 pieces each and 5 pawns each. Totally drawish. The game continues, knight c4, king d3, attacking the knight, and knight takes the pawn on a3. White really couldn't protect that pawn, so they gave it up. Still doesn't matter. Even this position is probably a draw. Better for black, of course, but very difficult to win, especially for grandmasters. Knight goes back to a7, bishop b8. A couple of strange moves. Attacking the knight. Knight goes back to c8 for some reason, not to c6. And king goes to the journey to the other side. And actually, this position already much better for black if they found the move bishop d6. Bishop d6, the bishops must be exchanged on d6 because there is no other move for white. And that knight endgame is winning for black. Not sure if Gukesh didn't realize it, didn't believe it, that is winning, or just didn't find the move bishop d6, which is more difficult to believe. And he played actually in this position f6. Knight went to d2, king f7, knight c4, attacking the bishop. Bishop goes back to f8. Knight a5, attacking the pawn on b5. Now Gukesh plays bishop d6. That's already too late. After exchanging all the more pieces, king go to b6. Now the pawn on b7 is falling. Knight goes to e4, f3, knight c3. King takes the pawn. Now it's knight against knight and 4 pawns against 4 pawns. e5. The king is returning back. The knight is attacking the pawn on e3. Obviously, it's protected by the knight. Knight e6. I'm sorry, king e6, e4. This is already total symmetry of the pawns. This is a draw, and they should be playing the next game now, but the game still continues. g6, king c5, f5. Exchange the pawns. The draw is approaching. Knight f2, attacking the pawn on e4. White protects the pawn with knight d2. Check on c4. Kings go back. Another series of moves that don't mean anything. Knight e3. Knight f4 check. This is still a draw. Kings go to d6. And here is the move knight d3. And knight d3 lost not only this game for Gukesh, but the tournament. He had 5 seconds to go on the clock. Praggnanandhaa had 10. This is the losing move because white plays knight g4 check. Kings go to g5 and white takes the pawn on e5. And this endgame is winning for white. Obviously, you cannot take the knight because after king takes, then the king goes to the side and the pawn will go, and queen, an extra pawn. So, and if the knight goes to f4, this is of course much more complicated, but on a grandmaster level, this is still easily winning for white. And Gukesh understood that this is a totally lost position and played king f4. So he decided to give up a piece and decided that maybe this position is better in terms of his abilities to save it. And yes, Praggnanandhaa had to be careful here, because if he loses those 2 pawns, that's a draw. But he was careful. Knight f2 check, king e3, knight g4 check, king f4, knight f6 check, h5, the pawn was under attack, king goes to e6, h4, king attacks the pawn on g6, the pawn is protected by the king, king g7, g5 the only move, h3, and no really moves. I mean, knight king goes to f4, king g6, the next move, and here black resigned. Let's say king g3, king takes g5, and after this move, the king will move away, the pawn will queen. So this is the final position of the tournament. In this position, Gukesh resigned. Praggnanandhaa won the tiebreak and became 2025 Tata Steel Super GM tournament winner. Thank you for watching.